You've probably sat down to work and felt nothing. Not tired, not distracted, just flat. And the thought that comes next feels completely reasonable. I'll wait until I'm in the right headspace. Maybe after lunch, maybe later tonight, maybe tomorrow morning when I'm fresher. That's not laziness. It's not a character flaw. It's actually a very logical response to how we understand our own minds. The problem is that the logic is quietly wrong, and that wrongness has a cost most people don't notice until they're looking back at a week that somehow produced almost nothing. This is about what actually happens when you wait for the mood to arrive, and why it usually doesn't. Most people experience their motivation as something that appears before they start working. You feel ready, you feel focused, something clicks, and then you begin. That's how it feels from the inside. And because that's the lived experience, it becomes the model. Motivation first, then action. Feeling right, then beginning. The issue is that this model gets the sequence backwards. Research in behavioral psychology consistently shows that motivation tends to follow action rather than precede it. In other words, the feeling of being in the mood to work is frequently a result of having already started, not a prerequisite for starting. But because we rarely notice this, we keep waiting for something that the waiting itself prevents from arriving. There's a concept in psychology around how humans regulate their own behavior called self-regulation, and one of its most documented findings is that emotional states are highly responsive to context and behavior. When you sit down and do nothing while waiting to feel ready, you're actually maintaining the very conditions that keep you feeling unready. The environment stays the same, the mental state stays the same, and the mood doesn't shift. This is different from saying you're doing something wrong. It's more that the brain is doing exactly what brains do. They respond to cues. They shift states based on input. Waiting passively for an internal shift while providing no new input is, from a purely mechanical standpoint, an inefficient strategy. Think about what this looks like in everyday life. You open your laptop. You have a report to write, or an email to draft, or a project to begin. You look at it. Nothing comes. You open another tab, check something, make tea, come back, still nothing. You tell yourself you'll feel better about it after a break. The break happens. You return. The feeling you were waiting for still hasn't materialized, and now there's also the mild pressure of time having passed. Or think about the student with an assignment due. They genuinely intend to work on it. They sit at their desk, they don't feel motivated, they wait. They scroll, they sleep. The next day the assignment is still there, but now the mood problem is joined by a proximity problem. The thing is closer, and the feeling is no different. What research suggests is happening in these moments involves something called activation energy. In behavioral science, this refers to the mental effort required to begin a task, separate from the effort required to continue it. Starting is the hardest part, not because of the task itself, but because the brain hasn't yet shifted into the mode that makes the task feel manageable. That shift almost always requires some form of engagement to trigger it, not passive waiting. This is why people frequently report that once they started something, it was easier than expected. That's not a coincidence. That's the activation energy dropping the moment the task was initiated. The mood arrived, but it arrived because of engagement, not before it. There's also something worth noting about how mood and productivity interact over time. When waiting for the right state becomes a consistent pattern, the brain begins to associate the task itself with resistance. The desk, the file, the project title start to carry a low-level signal of discomfort simply because of how many times you sat near them and did nothing. This isn't conscious. It builds quietly, and it makes the gap between sitting down and actually starting gradually wider. This is sometimes described in behavioral research as conditioned avoidance. The cue that should trigger work instead triggers a kind of internal hesitation because the association has been built up through repetition. You meant to work those other times. You weren't avoiding on purpose, but the pattern still registered. Here's the uncomfortable part that's worth sitting with. Most people believe they're protecting the quality of their work by waiting for the right mood. The reasoning is that work done while feeling unmotivated will be worse, slower, or harder to recover from. But research on performance and mood suggests this is largely a perception error. The quality of work produced in a neutral or even reluctant state is frequently indistinguishable from work produced in a state of high motivation, especially for tasks that require thinking rather than physical performance. What actually degrades in a low motivation state isn't the work itself. It's the tolerance for beginning. The task feels harder to start, but once the person is engaged, the output often stabilizes quickly. The mood catches up faster than expected when the work is already in motion. It's worth being clear about what this doesn't mean. This isn't an argument that rest is unnecessary. It isn't a case for working through exhaustion or ignoring genuine physical and mental limits. Some days the system genuinely needs recovery and not pressure. Fatigue is real, burnout is real, and the body communicates meaningful things. The distinction matters. There's a difference between not working because rest is genuinely needed and not working because the right feeling hasn't arrived yet. The first is responsive. The second is a pattern with a mechanism, and that mechanism tends to sustain itself without any outside interference. There's also no claim here that motivation is irrelevant. Some tasks genuinely benefit from high engagement states. Some creative work benefits from timing and internal readiness. The point isn't that mood never matters. The point is that mood is far more responsive to behavior than most people treat it as being, and that treating it as a fixed precondition creates a waiting pattern that can run for days, weeks, and longer, without the feeling ever reliably arriving on its own. What most people never stop to question is whether the mood they're waiting for was ever going to come independently. Not because they're bad at managing themselves, but because the mechanism simply doesn't usually work that way. The mood was always downstream, not upstream. Sitting with that realization is a little strange. It means all those times you waited, you weren't failing to access something that existed and was just out of reach. In many cases, you were waiting for something that your waiting was actively preventing from forming. That's not a comfortable thing to notice. It doesn't require a response or a plan. It's just a pattern that becomes more visible once you understand the mechanism behind it. The feeling of readiness is real. The desire to begin from a place of energy and focus is completely understandable. But the sequence most people assume, that the feeling comes first and makes the work possible, turns out to be a fairly reliable description of the exception, not the rule. The rule is quieter and a little less satisfying. Usually, the feeling comes because the work already started.